A quick introduction. Lee Dilworth, Principal SE in EMEA. Look after storage and availability. I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Yeah, so I'm Ben Meadowcroft. I'm on the product management team in the storage and availability group as well, principally focused on Site Recovery Manager.
Okay. And what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at some integration points between SRM 5.8 and vCloud Automation Center. And we're going to take you through a couple of examples, and God willing, the live demo will work. We have recorded the demo, but we thought last day, let's try doing some of it live and see how that goes. So, please kind of subliminally give lots of good thoughts to Ben, because he's going to drive that when we get to that point. So we obviously can't show you everything that's in the workflows that we've just released in 5.8, and we'll talk about those because we've only got 50 minutes, and as you can imagine, in the API that we've just released, there's a lot of new features, there's a lot of new methods. So, this is just one example to show you how to get it working. But, I'd encourage you all, if you're going to use VCAC and SRM together, and then you plug into, after the event, go back when we release this, take a look at the documentation to see what's new, and then you can apply these techniques. So a quick disclaimer slide. We will talk about one component that isn't available yet, which is not critical to the demo, but it's a nice to have, and it'll be available later in the year, so the disclaimer slide's there for that. This is the running order. I'll start kicking us off with some architectural considerations and deployment options. Then we're going to go into the demo, where Ben is going to talk about adding in the automation piece and some policy-based protection, and then we'll talk about what we need to do after the event. So a quick show of hands to make sure everyone's awake. How many people have got or have used Site Recovery Manager? Excellent, that's a lot more than the last session. And how many people have used or have looked at vCloud Automation Center? Excellent, good. Because the bad news is we haven't got time in the session to give you a 101 of each of those technologies, because then we'd run out of time to do this stuff. So if you are not familiar with them completely, try and just keep up if you can, but you are going to get the slides afterwards, so don't feel left out. You'll be able to review this stuff later. Okay. So the first thing to have a look at is, what are we actually going to do from a high level? There's a couple of things that we need to look at when we're going to try and protect VCAC itself and also the actual workloads that you're provisioning. So we're going to mostly focus on the bottom layer today. The point I've highlighted is number 2 there, which is you're going to have workloads that you provision through vCloud Automation Center, and we're going to show you how to add capabilities to that provisioning process to then automate protection of those workloads once they're deployed into vSphere. But one of the questions that we got in the first session is, what else do we do to protect VCAC itself? Because yes, it's going to be very nice that I can have this nice end-to-end provisioning process now, but what about if I lose a site and that happens to be the place where VCAC was running? What do we do for that? So we'll take a quick look at that. And then the other thing is, when I get to the other site, if I've had a failure, I might be there for a long time. So how can I keep my VCAC environment running? How can I keep those day 2 operations working? If I want to then provision additional workloads, how do we ensure that that service continues post failover? So we'll take a look at that as well. One of the things that you need to think about when you look at VCAC and SRM as 2 separate solutions, even though we're going to show them working together, is that they both have different views on the vSphere infrastructure. They're both designed to perform a different function. VCAC is designed as a provisioning and orchestration suite, and Site Recovery Manager is designed as a management and orchestration suite for recovery. But they don't necessarily see things in the same way. If you look at VCAC, we have reservations. A virtual machine will belong to a reservation. A reservation will belong to a cluster, and a cluster will belong to a managed endpoint in VCAC terms. And in Site Recovery Manager, you have data store groups where you might have your replicated devices, which you then associate with a protection group on the protected side, and then on the opposite side, you've got your recovery plan. So they each have different contexts and constructs for looking at virtual machines and managing them. So one of the things we're going to try and show you here is how, if you put the design down correctly on paper, you can try and keep these 2 things in sync so that they don't start to drift apart. Because what you want to try and achieve is a system where, as you are provisioning through VCAC, the automatic protection in SRM on the back end is not generating any errors, and everything is staying where you expect it to stay in both of the inventories. So if we take a look at what changes when we go across sites, as I said a second, in VCAC, when you provision a workload, you essentially you associate it with a reservation. And that reservation, like I said, is associated with a cluster, which is associated with an endpoint. But when you move those things around, that reservation will essentially break. And we'll take a look at a little later why that is. But basically what you've got to remember is when you move the VM, we don't have the new feature today that was talked about in the keynote, which is the ability to long-distance vMotion. So when you move VMs today, certain bits of information with that VM in the Virtual Center database will get updated. And one of the key things that will get updated is the Manage Object Reference ID. And think about that a little bit like a strand in a DNA chain. Once you change that ID, that particular solution loses track of that particular virtual machine. So from a VCAC point of view, when you fail a virtual machine over and you move it to the other site, you've essentially taken it out of one endpoint in VCAC and you've put it into the other endpoint, but you haven't told VCAC yet that you've done that. So VCAC is then wondering, where's that workload gone? It was over here, I was managing it, it seems to have vanished now for some reason, but I can see something over there that looks like it. So is that the same thing? Should I be managing that one now? Should I be sending the operational requests to there? So VCAC needs to know what it has to do at that point. In SRM's context, when you protect a virtual machine on the left-hand side of the screen there, and it's valid because you've either got vSphere replication running or you've got array-based replication running, those of you that have got SRM know what happens. In the inventory at the other side, you get a little icon with a little lightning bolt through it, and SRM is happy because it can see both sides of the coin. It can see the protected entity, and it can see the placeholder where that entity will be recovered if you move it. But ultimately, during that recovery, those roles will be swapped. So the protected virtual machine will move to the right-hand side and become the active virtual machine, and then the other side will now become the recovery virtual machine when you come back again. So things are going to change when you move. So that's why we're going to talk about how we handle that. So the VCAC components, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the VCAC components themselves. As a bare minimum, you're going to have an identity source, you're going to have the VCAC appliance, and then you're going to have the infrastructure as a service server. So bare minimum, you might have 3. You could probably get that down to 2 if you use SSO as the identity source in your home lab or in a test lab. So you've got 3 management components for VCAC. So if you do want to protect those from a site failure, then simply the best way to do it is to have them in their own protection group in SRM, almost like a management cluster protection group, and have them in their own recovery plan. And the bottom line is, if you're unfortunate enough to physically lose a site where they just happen to be running, then you obviously recover those ones first. They have to recover first before we do any of this provisioning workflow that we're going to see in a second. But there's nothing fancy that we have to do with those in terms of Site Recovery Manager. That's just standard virtual machine recovery, because they're the management components. So, for example, if this was as basic as we could make it here, we've got these 2 fictitious sites, Anaheim and Boulder in our example. And let's say Anaheim failed. It was on the left there, and that's where VCAC components were running. The first thing we'd do in the UI in SRM is we'd click on our management cluster recovery plan, and it would pop up our 3 management cluster elements, the identity source, infrastructure as a service appliance, and VCAC. We'd give it a few minutes for those to stand up, and then we'd start recovering the VCAC managed workloads underneath, as we're showing there. And we'll talk about how we kind of automate some of that. So, that's essentially what you have to do, and that's quite similar to how we did things with, I guess, vCloud Director a couple of years ago. But basically, the management components are very easy. 1 protection group, 1 recovery plan, flip those over if you lose the site. If you're doing planned migrations of VCAC workflows here, so you're not actually having a site down event, you obviously don't need to move the management components. So if you're just relocating some workloads, then you don't need to move the management layer. You can just move the VCAC, provision VMs, and as you'll see later when we get into the provisioning workflow, we'll show you how to change the reservations so that VCAC now knows that those workloads have gone to the other side, and VCAC will then be happy that it can manage them correctly. So we'll show you that as we go through the demo. So VCAC itself, as I said earlier, we've got 3 components there, but the one thing that you're going to have to do in this kind of multi-site design is you're going to have to define both sites as endpoints in VCAC. So in VCAC, an endpoint is just a site where you're going to consume resource. Obviously, there's different endpoints that we support with VCAC. We support things like VCD, AWS, and obviously vSphere. In this example, clearly, these are vSphere endpoints. So you define Anaheim as an endpoint, and you define Boulder as an endpoint in VCAC. And that VCAC management layer at the top there will then be able to provision workloads into each of those endpoints, depending on which selection the user makes. In each of those endpoints, you'll obviously have the VCAC agent installed against that vSphere server, and that's how VCAC knows where those endpoints are. The other thing we have to think about is, VCAC has its own database, just like SRM does. So VCAC also tracks the objects in that database. And the way that it does that is it uses a process called data collection on each of those endpoints. And that's a bit like, just looking at the virtual center entity, looking at the information that it can gather from it, pulling that information in from each of those two endpoints, and inserting it into the VCAC database. So one of the things that you'll see as we go through the demo is that at certain times, if you lose a site or you migrate workloads from one place to the other, you're going to have to stop data collection and start data collection so that VCAC has the correct view of the world, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail. Okay, so what have we got so far? This is just a quick recap of where we are at this point in our design. We know that we have some VCAC components at the top. Very easy to protect those, standard SRM stuff, nothing different there. Everybody's comfortable with that. We have 2 endpoints now in VCAC that we've defined as managed endpoints. So we've now essentially moved from a single site VCAC design to a multi-site design. And in each site, we're potentially going to provision workloads that we want to be able to recover in either direction. We know that we've installed the vSphere agent for VCAC into both sites because, again, they're a managed endpoint. And we've obviously got SRM running in each site as well in terms of SRM 5.8. Obviously, SRM 5.8 is not available yet, but it will be shortly. But that will be installed alongside Virtual Center. And the Virtual Center version that you'll be using with SRM 5.8 will be 5.5 update 2. So there's no Virtual Center 5.8 coming out. It'll just be an update to support that version. Okay, so we can now protect the components. We can protect the workloads. We know that we can describe where the objects are supposed to be from a component point of view, VCAC, SRM. And we now understand why we're even looking at any of this stuff. We now understand, hopefully as a group, that the reason that this matters is that when we move a virtual machine from left to right, something will change that we need to be aware of, and we need to fix that post-failover. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at how we add some automation so that all of this stuff that sounds like a lot of work, actually when you see the demo that we run through, we can make this very simple so that you can do all this in the provisioning workflow. So I'm going to hand over to Ben, who's going to walk you through how we do that piece.
Okay, thanks, Lee.
Cheers, Ben.
Okay, so before I kind of dive into the slides and things like that, just to, we talked about vCloud Automation Center, we talked about SRM, who's using what. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you guys use Power CLI? And how many of you guys are using vCenter Orchestrator? Okay, so a good mix then as well. So a couple of things I want to really bring out now is, we talked about automating things. What's actually under the hood that's going to enable us to do this? There's a couple of things. The example that we're showing is going to show it with vCloud Automation Center. This is like a really great demo that a lot of people are interested in. But the foundational technologies underneath this are actually, able to be consumed by vCenter Orchestrator or Power CLI as well. So, and this is, the first thing is that we've significantly extended SRM's public API, and that enables you to automate a lot of things within SRM. So we've had a public API for a while. It's, unless you're a developer, it's a little bit difficult to consume, let's be honest. But what we've delivered is the Power CLI team have added commandlets to be able to connect and automate that API via Power CLI. And the SRM team's also delivered a vCenter Orchestrator plugin for SRM as well that enables us to do a lot of this automation and a lot of the heavy lifting here, including providing detailed examples of this VCAC integration that we're going to demonstrate today. So that's the first thing is this, this SRM VCO plugin that we're providing. This enables you to automate the protection of workloads. It enables you to do all kinds of recovery settings, setting the priority group, the final power state of the VM, even actually being able to inject scripts into the recovered virtual machine to execute after it's been recovered. So this is all, completely automatable. And one of the key reasons why we're delivering that is that when I go out and speak to customers who, if you're protecting, 25, 30 VMs with SRM, it's probably not too onerous to go in and use the UI. But when you start doing like hundreds of VMs or you completely, you have a very common template that you just want to stamp out and have the same recovery settings, the same scripts. Rather than having to go into the UI and do this, there's a very simple way to automate that. And the other technology that we'll be using, if you're familiar with vCloud Automation Center, you'll be really familiar with how it can be extended with vCenter Orchestrator as well. And we're going to leverage some of that extensibility in this demonstration today. And then the third thing that it's not strictly related to this, but I really want to call it out because I think it works well in this kind of environment, is one of the new features that we delivered in SRM 5.8, which is the IP subnet mapping. So for those of you who are familiar with SRM, if you have to do, change IP addresses, the two ways of doing it today. First, you go into the UI, you right-click the VM that you're protecting, and you kind of configure the IP address on the recovery site and a protected site. So that's still there. The other way that you could do it in the previous versions of SRM was via CSV bulk import, and that's still there as well. But this is like a third new way that I think works really well with vCloud Automation Center. And when we do the demo, I'll show you how that works. But it's basically doing the IP changes using subnet IP-based rules. So what I mean by that is, say, on our Anaheim site, we're deploying VMs, and the ones we're protecting here, they have a /24 subnet, 192.168.110. whatever. And when we recover them, we want to recover them to a different subnet, a different IP address scheme. So 192.168.210. whatever. So with this capability, we just define one rule. And as we recover and migrate the VM to the other site, we'll automatically apply that to any VMs which have that 192.168.110 address. And we'll change the network prefix portion and retain the host identifier portion of the IP address. Which means that when you're automating these things, you just have these 2/24 subnets, and it's very easy to kind of map between them without having to do per VM configuration or mess around with CSV files. So making life a lot easier. And if you want more details on that, you can go back and look at the What's New session for SRM 5.8 that covers this as well. So we're talking about, okay, let's automate this. What are the pieces that are going to be involved? What are they doing? So the first thing, vCloud Automation Center, this is a piece that's going to give us that tenant-facing provisioning portal where the end users can come in and say, yeah, I need a new Linux machine, a new database, whatever, and they go in and they select that. This product has a great role in giving you that portal and also the governance surrounding the provisioning, where it's provisioned to, what resources it can use and so on. And this is what the vCloud Automation Center is doing in this example. And then, for those of you familiar with SRM, at the bottom we have SRM that's taking workloads that we've provisioned and protected and is then automating the recovery of those, migrating, VMs, tens of VMs, hundreds of VMs, thousands of VMs even, and completely automating that recovery operation for you. And then kind of in the middle, we have this bit here, the VCO and VCAC and SRM plugins. So this is kind of, one way that someone phrased it to me once is like VCO is kind of like the glue of the software-defined data center. And I think you could probably throw Power CLI in here as well, because it's a great way of tying things together and bridging components together. So what we've done here with the VCAC plugin, it gives you a really easy way to be able to register things like post-provisioning steps with the VMs that you're provisioning. And with SRM, we also provide a worked example of how you have a post-provisioning step that you can register with your VCAC blueprints. And as you provision them, it will automate the protection of those VMs and configure those recovery settings that we talked about earlier. Things like the recovery priority, the final power state, the scripts that we want to call pre or post-recovery for the VM. And so this is kind of the two things. We have the provisioning piece, we have the recovery piece, and we have the glue that ties them both together. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on that as we go through the deck and the demonstration. And so this is kind of the traditional layout that you'll have on each site. So we talked earlier about the vCloud Automation Center. It could be on either site as long as it has endpoints on both sites. Specific to each endpoint, you would want this, the VCAC vSphere agent kind of local to the vCenter that it's associated with. Also, on each site, you would have your vCenter servers, your SRM servers. Also, we tend to recommend having a VCO server per site as well, using the distributed VCO installation. The standalone VCO installation. And this really gives you the, then you can have a single VCO server that's registered with the vCenter on each site and with the VCAC as well. And make sure that when you're running those workflows, they're really local to the data center where they're located. Okay, so this is my picture with lots of icons and things on that I'll be taking you guys through. Yeah, can you pass me the green? Thanks. So we'll talk about, what we'll talk about is how we, within VCAC, you have this concept of catalog items. And they're really a combination of two things: a blueprint, which is kind of like a template of the VM, or the set of VMs that you want to provision. And then the association of those blueprints with business groups. So this could be like your finance department, your HR department, your development teams. Could all have these separate business groups that you configure within VCAC. And this is really a business level construct for grouping different organizations that you want to be aware of within vCloud Automation Center. So we have the blueprints. This is kind of the templates for the VMs. And we have the business groups who are going to use those. And kind of this piece really all brings up the catalog items. So you can see here, if we look at the text here, we have the Ubuntu production, which is pointing to our blueprint, and then finance, which is a business group that we're going to request. And then the tenant sees this, and they have this little request button. So when we go through the demonstration, I'll go through some of the detailed configuration steps to set this up. But there's a few prerequisites that need to be in place. If you want to protect with SRM, you have to have SRM installed for a start. But you need to have things like the inventory mappings configured as well. And so have valid inventory mappings for the compute, network, and folder items. And also, here we're using, the VM that you provision has to be replicated. So in the example that we're going to demonstrate today, we're actually going to show how you can control the provisioning of a VM onto a replicated data store that's associated with a protection group. So the example is going to be array-based replication and how we control that. And then, so this then leads a VM to being replicated over to the other site and then configured for protection with SRM and the inventory mappings that we talked before. And really the way that we're going to tie this together in the example that I'll show you shortly is that we're using this combination of the blueprints, the business groups, and what reservations they can see, storage policies and so on, to really control the placement in terms of which cluster the VMs are going to be positioned onto, which networks they're going to be attached to, and which folders they're going to be deployed into as well. And ensure that each of these components is going to be landed on one that SRM has an inventory mapping for. So we'll go through that. Then the next thing that we'll talk about is how the blueprint leads to the storage policy, and the business group leads to the reservation, and how we can use the intersection of those two to really control the resource that, in terms of storage that the VM will land on. And a way that, in this example, we can provision this VM into specific protection groups within SRM, and how we can control that. So just at this point, I'll pause just for a second, just to be clear that this is one example of how you can do this. All of these capabilities, like protecting a VM, setting the recovery settings, and so on, we all have very fine-grained VCO workflows as well to enable this. And we have an out-of-the-box workflow that shows this end-to-end as well. But there's a lot of different combinations that you can do. Some of the other capabilities that you can automate is being able to create new vSphere replication protection groups or new array-based replication protection groups as well. Add those protection groups to a site-wide recovery plan and things like that. So there's a lot of capabilities that are automatable in the new API and the new VCO workflows and Power CLI integration. But this is just kind of demonstrating one of those as an illustration. So the provisioning piece. For those of you who are kind of like SRM knowledgeable, but not so much about VCAC, I'll explain this a little bit. VCAC really has a concept of reservations, and these are reservations that are tied to business groups. So earlier we talked about like the HR department, the finance department. They'll have a set of resources that they can provision into. And so for human resources, it's going to be this set of data stores here, these 3 clusters here. For finance, they have another 3 clusters. So we can see in this example, HR has a dedicated set of data stores here with a storage policy, which we're going to call gold replicated, fairly straightforward. And finance is going to have a dedicated set of data stores with that same policy. And then for the silver policy, we're basically just going to share the data stores across the two groups. They're just going to have reservations in the amount that they can reserve, but the actual data stores and so on, we don't care which one they provision to because we're not going to replicate it. We don't need to control that, at least from the SRM perspective. And then when we have this intersection of when this person comes in and they click the button to request it, under the hood, this is what's happening. It's saying, hey, I'm the finance group. I'm going to go provision onto the finance reservation. And hey, this blueprint that they've requested, it's a production one. You know, in this example, all my production stuff's going to land on my gold replicated storage. I want to protect that. And then that's going to map to the protection group, this finance gold protection group here. And so all these data stores will be associated with that protection group. Okay, so it's late on a Thursday. You guys have been here all week. I've shown you enough slides. Let's go actually have a look at some stuff. Oh, let me log in first. Don't want you guys seeing my password. Okay. Okay, sweet. Let's switch over. So if you guys at the back can't see this, there's like tons of seats here, so feel free to move forward. I'll go through the VCAC UI first, because this is one that some of you may be unfamiliar with if you're more SRM-centric. But this is how we set up the reservations. This is fairly straightforward. We have a couple of reservations that I'll just show you. Let's go look at my finance reservation first. I'll also warn you, this is my little demo lab, so it's really small. Ah, great. See, this is live demos. This is proof that it's live, so. Oh, I need to be focused on the thing to log in. Okay, so while I'm logging in, and if you guys have done the hands-on lab, you'll be familiar with this password. I'm very unimaginative. Okay. Okay, so let's go have a look at our reservations. Here we go. So we're looking at our finance reservation here. Let's have a look at some of the configuration that we've already done here. I'm really imaginative. I've called this Anaheim Finance Production. So yeah, no bonus points for originality there. But let's have a look at the resources that we're consuming here. And this is just my little demonstration lab, so it's fairly small. But you can see, you know, we've associated a couple of data stores in the VCAC vernacular storage paths with this reservation. So the first one here is Anaheim Local 1, and then I've got Anaheim SRM 1. So this is my non-replicated, and this is my replicated data stores. So fairly straightforward to understand. Now, if you're familiar with your VCAC, it's like, okay, well, I can provision to either of those data stores. How am I going to control which one of those two it's going to land on when the user clicks a request? That's fairly straightforward. We just have to go and set up some reservation policies.
Just one thing to say, can you just flip back to that
previous sure.
screen? So one thing to say on, so obviously the two endpoints here in SRM's UI will correspond to the protected and the recovery site. So if you see the SRM UI, that's how you'll see that. But just notice on this screen here where we're in the reservation, you'll see the first column says storage path. So when I talked earlier about the data collection process and the fact that that needs to be stopped and started as virtual machines are moved around if a site fails, one of the things that does when you actually restart data collection for the virtual machines you've now recovered is it updates that path recovered site. Because obviously this path is specific to the site where the virtual machines were before the failure. So now you move them to the Boulder site because they were in Anaheim, and that storage path temporarily will be out of date because we've now on a different array, we're now on a different UUID, so that needs to be changed. So that data collection process in VCAC, or the restart of it for those managed VMs, will correct that inside VCAC's database. So this is one of the things that you'll see us do in the post-provisioning and the automation piece later on. So I just wanted to kind of mention that because I will talk about the storage path later, but now you've seen it and where it is and why it needs to be changed. Okay, thanks, Lee. I appreciate that. And one of the things I'll clarify as well, you know, we're definitely in this example, we're going to talk about, you know, failing over and retaining VCAC management as we move the workloads between sites. Now, just to be clear, you know, you don't have to retain the VCAC management. If you only care about provisioning to one site, and you know, when you kick in the SRM process and it recovers the VMs, those workloads are up and running. They don't need you to have the VCAC pieces over there unless you want to continue VCAC management of them on that recovery site. But if you just care about, hey, I've had a disaster, my site's blown up,
let's get those business services over there running. That's just handled out of the box by SRM. If you want to layer on, some additional management, this is a piece that Lee, I think, we'll cover in more detail later. So, reservation policies. You guys may be figuring out by now that I'm not very imaginative. Gold and silver, that's so typical. But yeah, two policies here. My gold policy and my silver policy, just point these out. Gold, silver, that's it. All you do, you just create these, give them a name, very basic. It's like, okay, well, how then do I assign that to the actual data stores if I don't do that here? This is where you go in and you go to your compute resources. And I'll go into this little endpoint here. And there's a handy little tab called configuration. And you see here, this is the point where I'm saying, hey, I've got these resources, I've got these policies, let's bring them together. We have Anaheim local 1, which is my non-replicated storage. Give that the silver policy. And then my Anaheim SRM 1, which is a replicated one, I'm going to give that gold. I also have another replicated data store, I'm going to make that gold as well. But these two belong to the same reservation. This actually belongs to a different reservation entirely. And then if I just quickly go through to the catalog item, I go to my production, go in and populate the request. I'll just show you the configuration of this really quick. But you can see, if I go into my storage here, you can see for this particular blueprint that I've configured it to be replicated to my gold replication. I've applied this policy here to the blueprint. And so this is kind of like, by default, when I ask for an instance of this, it will be put on my gold storage. Now, you can also enable the customer to override this if I click here. The customer can say, actually, no, I don't want to do this. I can just put it to silver. That's pretty straightforward. But you as the administrator have the control when you're defining the blueprint, whether you're going to let them override it or not. So for a lot of use cases, you may well say, if it's production, I'm just going to put it in there as hard requirement that it's going to be on gold and not allow the customer or the end user to override it. That's perfectly fine as well. And if you looked at some of the other sessions that we've been showing at this VMworld about SPBM integration with VCAC and the storage profiles, they have a lot more detail on this as well. So I'd recommend looking at that session after VMworld. Okay, so let me switch back to the slides quickly. So don't worry, we'll have one more demonstration for you guys. But I just wanted to really show the things we talked about here, the catalog item to the blueprint and to the business group. This is what the user sees. They have this catalog item. It's defined by these things that you set up within vCloud Automation Center, which really drive, the blueprint drives a storage policy, the business group drives a reservation and resources, and the intersection of those gives you that protection group that SRM uses to say, hey, I know this is a set of resources I want to protect. Now, one of the other things I talked about earlier was, hey, there's a ton of recovery settings that we want to be able to set, like recovery priorities, scripts, and things like that. I want to provision like a ton of Linux servers. Maybe I want to put a message anytime I recover a Linux message when the admin logs in. Puts a little message on the prompt there to say, hey, this is a recovered VM, just so that they know to go in and just check that everything looks okay. Kind of a message of the day. And this is all handled by this post-provisioning action that we're going to talk about now and kind of quickly demonstrate. So I hear cheering in one of the other rooms. There's probably a better presentation than this one. Sorry, guys. Okay. Oh, they heard me through the wall, do you think? Okay. I have a confession for you guys now. So I hope you forgive me for this, but this is my lab environment, so it's really slow to provision stuff. So I'm going to do a pre-recorded example of the provisioning. But I just wanted you guys to know that before I actually clicked play and pretended I was actually doing it here. Actually, the whole fading effects and stuff like that would have probably given it away anyway. But this is what the actual tenant will see. Let's see what the tenant does. So they first come in, they see the service catalog, I'm actually logged as an administrator, so I can see both of my Ubuntu production machines, finance and HR. But if I was a finance user, I'd just see one of these, just the Ubuntu production finance machine. So tenant sees this, they say, oh, there's a nice request button there. It's kind of like the only thing they can click, really. So they'll go over and click that. So let's pretend I'm in HR, I'm requesting a new server. Because, HR people often request new Linux servers. It's very common. As I mentioned, my lab's slow. So, there we go. Okay, so now I'll show you again. This is doing a clone workflow. They fill in the request information, so the number of machines they want to provision, CPUs, memory, and so on. Obviously, you can control all this via the reservations and so on. Here as an administrator, I've also decided I'm going to prompt them for the priority group. So I'm going to let them set themselves as priority 2. Obviously, you don't have to prompt them for that. You could embed it within the blueprint as well, but just giving you an example of setting this at runtime. And then I've gone and requested this. I'll actually go in and let's have a look at the request now. So we can have a little bit more look at the detail. So you see all the successful ones that were previously done? It does work, I promise. Okay. So I go in, I can look at the request details. Let's have a look at the storage. You guys have already seen this bit, but we see that we're provisioning one disk here, fairly basic. We're putting it onto the gold. So we have our gold policy here. And again, this is, really gives us that control over where it's going to land so that we can protect it successfully with SRM. And then this is the interesting bit. Actually, I'll bring this over and I'll pause this so we can look at this a second. Okay, the other thing that I can put in at the blueprint, and if you're familiar with VCAC, you'll know there's kind of like a hierarchy of objects. You can assign custom, what we're seeing here is some of the custom properties that we're associating with this request. And those custom properties can come from things like the blueprint, from the business group, and so on. So a really common example that you guys may be using who are doing vCloud Automation Center with vSphere. You can see here, if I want to control which folder in vCenter this is going to be added to in the inventory, I just have this custom property, VMware Virtual Center folder. It's going to be in my Anaheim/Human Resources folder. So this enables me to put it in the right folder. I can put permissions on that folder and all that good stuff. So this is kind of like a really common way of extending and giving some additional control. And as I mentioned, I've set this on the business group level. So this will apply to any VM that a user in this business group will provision. So the other thing that we have here, there's some stuff here around the VCO endpoint that we're going to use for post-provisioning, and there's some more details on that as well. A lot of these custom properties are actually added when you register the VCO to workflow to the blueprint directly, just via VCO. But some of the custom things we have in this example, I'm going to have a command that I want to add to the VM's recovery settings, give it a name, say that this is going to run on the virtual machine, it's going to time out after 5 minutes if I'm not successful. And then also set things like the final power state, I'm going to turn that on. And this is all embedded within the blueprint here. So let's continue and see what happens. So Lee's looking a little nervous because this bit's running a lot longer than it did last session. So hopefully I have some time to kind of wrap up his bit. Okay, so would help if I fast forwarded it a little. There we go. So this is the VM that we provisioned. We can see that we've attached it to a network that we're expecting, to the data store that we wanted it to. And this is all controlled by the reservation and storage reservation policies. So we're using that policy-driven placement within vCloud Automation Center to provide this. Let me click off here. You can see also, this has landed, it's been replicated by array-based replication and is in the HR group. Let's quickly switch over to the SRM site. You guys may be seeing that this is in the web client, by the way. If you haven't seen the What's New sessions, SRM now supports the web client also. So let's have a look at the VM in this protection group here. So HR0002, yeah, it's protected. And look, we have the recovery resource pool and hosts and so on have all been set successfully. So let's go have a look at some of the recovery settings. So we can also check that, yep, it's in the recovery plan. Yep, there it is, just at the bottom there. So let's go and check that those settings we set are successfully done. We have the priority. We can go drill down into it a little bit and look at the post power on steps. And hey, we've got this message of the day to our admins whenever they log in. And there we go. We have the script that's going to be executed with the timeouts that we specified executed on the recovered virtual machine. So just think for a minute what the tenant saw there and what the administrator had to do during the request process. So I'll switch back over to this, but from the tenant perspective, what they see, they have this nice little form, they click request, they fill in a few details about why they want it and so on. From the administrator side, you've already set up your inventory mappings and all this kind of stuff. You said, hey, for these blueprints, I want it to have this script. But then every time you make that request, there's no administrator involvement. You compare that to SRM 5.5 and earlier. It's like if you wanted to set recovery priorities or recovery settings, that would have to be captured in a form somewhere or in a ticket system. Then the admin would have to go into the UI and start finding the VM, configuring it, checking it, and all that kind of stuff. More of a manual process, less automation. From here, you set it up once, and then it just continues to stamp out those VMs exactly as you want each time. So that was the second demo. And just as a design checkpoint, what we're doing, we're automating the protection of the VMs using the VCO plugin, and we're using VCAC policy controls to be able to ensure that we're placing the VM in the right place in the infrastructure that we can protect it with SRM. So next we'll talk about, okay, we've protected these workloads, we can recover them, but how do we manage them after recovery? And I'll pass over to Lee to cover that. Thanks, Lee.
Cheers, Ben. Okay, so I think Ben did a really good demo there about how you can just integrate all of the SRM components that you see in the UI into that provisioning process. But there's going to come a point where if you do have a failure and you move the workloads to the other side, you're going to have to start to think about, has any of that nice configuration now been affected slightly, should we say, by the fact that the virtual machine's moved? So the first thing we want to look at is, how does the SRM workflow affect the VCAC management piece? And obviously, we have a couple of major workflows in SRM that most of you will be familiar with. So we have things like protecting the virtual machines, testing them, and then migration after failover. Obviously, when you protect a VM, we've just seen how we can automate that. So nothing bad to report there. Ben showed you that simple example, but there's lots of other things you could layer onto that. So when you protect the virtual machine now, you can actually do that all through VCAC. The VCO plugin will then populate all of the right fields in SRM, and as Ben just correctly said, you can expose as much or as little of that as you want to the consumer who's actually going to go into, and as we requested on Ubuntu VM. But as you showed in the demo, when you flip to SRM, all of the relevant pieces are in place now, and you haven't got any nasty little yellow warning triangles to go and figure out what's wrong. So protecting the VMs is fairly simple. Testing, as of kind of 5.5 and the later versions of VCAC, 6.0, that used to be a problem in the earlier versions because VCAC didn't like it when you ran an SRM test. Because when you ran an SRM test, it would pop up another virtual machine as a test VM or for snapshot if it was vSphere replication, or for snapshot of the storage device if it was a RAID replication. And what happens then? VCAC sees two virtual machines that look to be the same name, and it doesn't know what to do with this one that's just suddenly magically appeared, and then it magically disappears when you end the test. In the 5.5 version and 6.0 version, we fixed that, and we have a managed by property that we set now so that if VCAC sees the test VM, it knows that it's SRM doing a test failover. So that's okay. But what about after migration? What about if we we move the workloads over? And as Ben said, you don't have to resume day two operations. Day two operations on the VMs that you've moved inside VCAC. So if in your business you say just get the workloads up, we don't care that VCAC is down for a few days, then that's fine. But if you want to be able to put those services back in place pretty quickly, then there are a couple of things we need to think about post failover. And as I said at the start of the session, and this is kind of we're coming full circle now, there's a couple of things that break, and I've kind of zoomed in on one part of Ben's diagram that he used in the post-provisioning step. The things that will be affected, and I'll just borrow the little clicker that you've put there, are the storage policy and the storage path. And remember in the UI, I pointed this bit out, there was a storage path column for the reservations, and then obviously the reservation itself that the virtual machine's assigned to. will need to be updated into the VCAC database on the surviving site. So how do we fix these two entities here? So the first thing that we do is, recover VCAC. Remember I said, very simple, normal protection group, move the components over, VCAC will come back up. At that point, though, we're going to need to alter the data collection. The data collection for our virtual machine, or Ben's Ubuntu VM, was on Anaheim, and we've now moved the VM to Boulder. So we need to tell VCAC, stop trying to data collect in Anaheim for that virtual machine, that Ubuntu HR VM. It's not there anymore. You need to go and data collect in Boulder, because that's where it is. So you stop and start the data collection for that set of virtual machines in VCAC. I'll talk about how you automate that in a second. And at that point, VCAC will go and update the database, and then it will correct that storage path for you. You don't do that until the SRM recovery has got past the storage phase, because obviously at that point, we still don't know if the storage paths have been updated correctly. In the SRM recovery, we will update, we'll rescan the HBAs, we'll populate the data stores in the virtual center inventory. Then we run the VCAC collection in the background, and then it'll have the appropriate view of the storage. So that is actually a manual step. But I know everybody's heads will probably sink when you say manual step, but there is a way that we can automate that, and we'll touch on that at the end. The final thing is we have to update the reservation. Remember right at the start, I said in VCAC, if it's a vSphere managed virtual machine, it's associated with a reservation. The reservation is associated with a compute resource, and the compute resource is associated with the cluster of the endpoint, the managed endpoint. So that reservation has now been changed because we failed it to Boulder. It's associated with a new reservation that is in Boulder, so we need to tell VCAC that that's the case. That won't happen just by doing data collection or redoing data collection. That's not one of the things that data collection will flip over for us. So we need to change the reservation for the managed virtual machines if we want to continue managing them through VCAC whilst our primary site is down. So you can do that manually. It's very simple to do in the VCAC UI. So I could just say, go away, do it manually, or we can flip back to the live demo and show you how to do that. It's kind of click, next, finish, and done. But that's a bit boring, and you probably wouldn't like doing that for 100 reservations or a couple of thousand VMs. So one of the things that we've done, and this is in limited availability now, so you can request it through your VMware account teams. It's going to go GA later this year and possibly start next year, but it is available now as a limited release, is something called the Cloud Client for VCAC. The Cloud Client isn't just for this use case. It's not just for DR. The Cloud Client, the VCAC guys have essentially built a verb-based command line utility that allows you to interact with the VCAC APIs in a very similar to kind of PowerShell, I guess, if you like. One of the things that we can do with it, it's a Java application. So to use this, and we've built this into our demo labs, is you'd essentially have Java installed in the SRM server on each site. You then load the Cloud Client into each SRM server. And one of the things that Ben mentioned, and those of you that are SRM admins will know this, is that in the recovery workflow, you can add in your own script steps to execute. So you can guess where this is going pretty quickly, I'm assuming. Basically, what you'll do is you'll add a step after the storage recovery, and that will be used to call the Cloud Client, tell the Cloud Client to stop and start data collection for the VMs that are in that recovery plan. So one of the neat things that the guys in the VCAC team have done who built this is they've put in lots of verb-based commands related to SRM, so you can basically tell it, stop data collection for SRM recovered VMs, then restart data collection for them once the storage is ready. So what this basically does is it looks at your recovery plan, and let's say Ben's recovery plan just had his HR VM in it. It would say, I only need to look at that VM, I'll go and stop data collection for it and start it over here on this site. And then it'll exit 0 and return. Recovery plan continues, power's on the VM comes up. In your recovery plan, you then inserted another call-out step, which goes back to Cloud Client and tells it, now the VM is on and it's running, it's powered on, can you do one more thing for me? Can you actually go and change the reservation in this VCAC server that's over here? And again, there's verbose-based commands that you just embed in that call-out step. So again, it's a one-time thing you have to do. You only have to insert those commands once, and then they're locked into the system forever. So whenever you execute that recovery plan, those workflows will be executed. So when you kick that second one in, it'll go back into the Cloud Client, go back to the VCAC API, and it'll say, okay, we now need to look at all the VMs in this recovery plan. There's only one, this HR Ubuntu thing that the HR team have requested for. the reservation was this reservation over here in Anaheim. I need to change it to this reservation over here in Boulder. And it'll flip that inside the VCSE database for you. Once that's done, those two little red X's that I showed you on the other slide have now been fixed. So by simply doing that one-click SRM recovery, with this cloud client embedded into the recovery plan, you can now fail over all of the managed workloads and have all of them corrected inside the VCSE database and then carry on with your D2 operations. So this is not the kind of thing you're going to be doing every day of the week. And trust me, if you had to do this stuff manually, it's not a big deal either. It's just a couple of clicks. But we figured out that it would be a lot nicer if we had these commands inside Cloud Client to allow you to automate this. And as I said, this is limited availability now, so you can request it. It's not kind of beta code or non-supported code, but it is limited availability, so you will have to sign an NDA if you want this. We are testing it, and there's a new version coming in a couple of weeks that adds some more functionality for us. But you can get hold of this if you need it, so speak to your VMware account team. So what we've shown there is that not only can we provision the workflow, not only can we provision the virtual machines, we've now got, with the new plugin, the ability to expose all of the SRM attributes in the API through the provisioning process and actually move those workloads over to the other side. And shortly, or in limited availability, we've also got another utility you can embed into that workflow that will take care of correcting any changes in the environment that have occurred should you actually be unfortunate enough to lose a site. So not only now can you actually make sure that everything is protected and set up in SRM, that's all automatic, but if the worst happens and you have to shut the site down or you've lost the site, everything will keep going. Day 2 operations will be resumed when that site comes back up. So that's a nice, neat solution now in terms of what we can integrate. As Ben said, this piece in the middle now really glues VCSE and SRM together very nicely for the first time ever. So this is something we've been waiting for a long time, and I hope that when you get these two solutions in, you'll go and look at the API document, have a look at all the other workflows that we didn't have time to cover today. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. In fact, I think the only thing you can't do is...
Don't tell them that, Lee.
No, I'll tell them that.
Okay,
the only thing you can't do is configure replication for a vSphere replication from the ground up. You have to pre-configure that, but everything else you can do.
Yep.
Everything else you can do. So take a look at that API document when it comes out. There's a new there's a draft of it on the beta site, but that's available. So with that, what we'll do now is we can take some questions if you want to ask questions. Those of you that don't want to stay around for questions, if you've got flights to go to, get back to your hotel and check out, or just flake out on the floor because you've had a long week, there'll be no offense at all if you do that. But I'd just like to say a really big thank you for staying till the last. This is the hardcore crowd who stayed till nearly 2:30 on the last day. I hope you had a good week. You all look a bit jaded. Hopefully too many of you haven't got a 10-hour flight tonight like I have. But safe trip home. Hope you enjoyed the event. And if you have any questions, please come to the front and ask them. If not, thanks for coming to the session. We really appreciate you turning up.
Yeah, thank you guys and gals.